Welcome to Realms of the Otherworld, Episode 13, The Highgate Cemetery. Highgate Cemetery is located in the area of Highgate, London, just 20 minutes north of the London city centre. Sprawling across a massive hill covering 37 acres, the cemetery is supposedly one of the most terrifying and haunted places in the world. In the early 19th century, London was at an all-time high in population. Space was scarce. Along with an overflowing of living people, there was also an overflow of dead people. Cemeteries were hard to come by. The few that were there were filled to the brim with the deceased. Many places were reusing grave plots and burying multiple family members in one grave. Graves were shallow. Quicklime was used to decompose bodies so that new ones could be added. Space was running out. Cemeteries were being squeezed between restaurants and shops. The smell was horrendous of rotting flesh and decay. Something had to be done. This was no way to honor the dead and no way to live. Parliament decreed that 7 new cemeteries should be opened in the countryside just outside of London. Highgate Cemetery was one of these 7, and it was opened in 1839. Parliament created the London Cemetery Company to build these cemeteries. Stephen Geary, architect and founder, James Bunstone Bumming, surveyor, and David Ramsay, garden designer, were assigned to Highgate. 17 acres of land that was once the Ashurst estate was purchased for £3,500 just downhill from the Highgate village. Within 3 years, the landscaping was meticulously designed and created using a huge variety of professional plants and pathways. The architecture was beyond incredible, using themes from other times, monuments, sculptures, and tombs. The cemetery was the most lavish place in London to be buried, and soon became the most popular, especially for the wealthy. On Monday, May 20th, 1839, the cemetery was dedicated to St. James by Right Reverend Charles James Blumfield, Lord Bishop of London. In addition to the gravesites and monuments, 15 acres were set aside for the Church of England, and 2 acres for the others. Rights of burial were granted for a limited time or forever. There were 2 chapels on the property done in Tudor Gothic style. There were wooden turrets and a bell tower with an archway below it, which led to the cemetery. There were several architectural styles. The central part just under the arch was Egyptian Avenue, with 16 vaults lining a passageway on either side. Each vault had 12 coffins for each family. The Circle of Lebanon had 20 vaults in the inner circle, and 16 vaults classical style that were added in the 1870s. In the center was a cedar of Lebanon tree that was there from the Ashurst estate. Above was the Gothic-style terrace catacombs built on the old terrace of Ashurst. It held 825 dead total. For the next 20 years, Highgate was the most desirable place to be buried. In 1856, it was extended an additional 20 acres on the other side of Swaine's Lane. This was to be known as the East Cemetery. A tunnel went under Swaine's Lane to the church on the west side. This would allow for a hydraulic lift for coffins to descend under the church and for them to go into the tunnel. The first burial on the east side was in 1860. By that time, there were 10,400 graves on the west side. By the 1900s, people were beginning to lose interest in elaborate and expensive grave sites with extravagant memorials due to declining fortunes after World War II. Some families still purchased select rights of burial into the 1930s, but most were wanting simple and less expensive graves. Many ended up moving from the area, and their family plots were left to waste away. In the 1960s, the London Cemetery Company went bankrupt and was taken over by United Cemetery Company. This company had a hard time maintaining the grounds and eventually ran out of money, and the cemetery was closed. Slowly, the vegetation crept into the abandoned cemetery and grew over the gravestones, memorials, and elaborate monuments. In the 1970s, Hammer horror films were at their peak, and they often used Highgate Cemetery as the backdrop for many of their movies. Interest in the cemetery began to peak once again. Stories began to circulate about the strange happenings in the cemetery. There were rumors of evil cults holding ceremonies after dark, men in dark robes, animals found with the blood drained from them. Many would write to the newspapers telling of their frightening experiences. One man had his car break down by the cemetery. He saw an apparition with glowing red eyes peering at him from behind the bars of the gates. Another man walking along Swaine's Lane was thrown to the ground by a creature that glided from the cemetery wall. A car's headlights flashed towards this being, and it dissolved into thin air. There is another story of a ghost bicyclist. A mother was at the cemetery, and she saw an apparition of a man on a bike pedaling up the hill. Another story is that of the Hat Man. He is tall with a top hat, walking casually across the road and vanishing into a wall. When he walks, people hear the chapel bells ringing. Some people have seen an old woman ghost. She is mad with long gray hair flowing behind her as she runs through the graveyard. It is said she is looking for her children that she murdered when she was still alive. Others have seen a shrouded figure who stares into the ethers, not aware of being seen until people get very close, and then the apparition disappears, and then reappears a few meters away, staring off into space. Sounds are heard in the cemetery: banshee wails, voices, and bells. Spectral faces are seen. People claim to be physically assaulted by unseen hands. There is also rumored to be a ghost nun and a woman in white. At one point, there were even exploding coffins. Originally, for the vaults, the coffins were lined with lead so that they would not leak out the remains. The gases would build up in these coffins, and eventually the pressure would cause them to explode. They solved this problem by inserting pipes into the coffins, and the gas would escape, and they would light the pipes, and the gas would slowly burn off. The most famous story, however, is that of the Highgate vampire. He was said to be a medieval nobleman, a black magic practitioner from Romania. His coffin was brought to London to Highgate from continental Europe in the 1700s by his followers. They also bought a house in the West End and buried him on the property there. This area ended up being part of the Highgate Cemetery. All was well and good until the Satanists began performing rituals there. This is according to Sean Manchester. Then supposedly, all hell broke loose and the vampire awoke from his deep sleep. Rumor has it that the vampire was very tall, dark, and floated smoothly across the cemetery grounds. The air turns cold when he is near, and clocks and watches stop. Animals are frightened of him, and it is said that he is the one draining blood from the foxes. His look is hypnotic and terrifying. Two men, David Ferrant and Sean Manchester, who were very much into the occult, were absolutely sure that this vampire was real, and they were determined to exterminate the creature. Ferrant had written to a newspaper claiming he had an experience with the king vampire. A lot of publicity was focused on these men and their claims. People grew to be very interested in the story about a vampire and followed the stories of Ferrant and Manchester with excitement. The fervor of these men grew, and they soon decided to take decisive action against the Highgate vampire. They organized a vampire hunt on March 13, 1970, Friday the 13th. Many people showed up with garlic, wooden stakes, and hatchets. Several people descended on the cemetery, ripping up graves, breaking open tombs, and trampling the grounds. They plunged wooden stakes into corpses, decapitated many of them, and even moved skeletal remains to strange places. One man found a skeleton in the driver's seat of his car. The cemetery grounds were severely damaged, and the vampire grave was never to be found. In 1975, the Friends of the Highgate Cemetery was formed to conserve the cemetery, land, plants, and animals so that the property could be visited and appreciated once again by the public and used actively for burials. Some of the overgrown foliage has been removed, paths cleared, and monuments repaired. Over the years, there has been more and more restoration. Egyptian Avenue, the Circle of Lebanon, Terrace Catacomb, and 70 other monuments have been listed with the English heritage. Some of the more well-known people buried here are Karl Marx, sci-fi author Douglas Adams, James Holman, a famous blind man that used vibrations to guide his way, and Adam Worth, possibly the inspiration for Sherlock Holmes's nemesis, Professor Moriarty. The chapel was reopened in 2011, restored using original colors, and it is currently used for funerals. Both the east and west sides are open as active burial sites. Currently, there are 170,000 people laid to rest at Highgate and 50,000 graves. The cemetery is running out of space, and talks are in progress about reusing some of the older graves. The west side is still very overgrown and is only accessed by guided tours. The east side is open to self-guided walks. Entrance fees are charged to maintain and beautify the cemetery. No videos allowed, and tickets for the east side can be purchased online. These are just some of the terrifying tales about the infamous Highgate Cemetery. Do you dare take a tour? Information is below. Thank you for watching Realms of the Otherworld. Please hit the big thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Ring the notification bell so you don't miss any new episodes. And be sure to support us on Patreon. Link is in the description area below the video screen. Have a great evening. Take care.